Welcome to the 26th tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through how to automate the process of transferring ownership of content to another user on your Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance. To showcase how this can be used in the real world, I'll incorporate a user content mapping file that will allow you to scale this operation across any number of users. When attempting to transfer ownership of content, keep in mind the rules associated with user licensing and permissions. To learn more about those rules, review the link on screen. Now, let's jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin developing a script that transfers the ownership of data sources and workbooks from one user to another. All right, before I get started, what I want to do is I want to provide a little bit more context on what we're trying to achieve throughout this tutorial. And to do that, I'm going to jump over to my Tableau Cloud instance. The idea of this tutorial and what we're trying to achieve is we're trying to migrate the content owned by one account to another account. And what that looks like is we're going to take the data sources and workbooks owned by this account here. So in this case, this account has 5 workbooks and 13 data sources associated with it. And we're going to migrate that over to this account here. So the second account that is basically tied to me, just a different email address. And you'll notice that the content owned by this account is currently 0. Aside from subscriptions, they do have subscriptions, but we're not worried about those for the purposes of this tutorial. And again, at the end of this tutorial, what you're going to see is the contents, those 5 workbooks and those 13 data sources are going to appear underneath this account because we've migrated them from one user to another or one account to another. And the way we're going to do this, we're going to do this in a scalable way. We're going to create a user content mapping file that looks like this. And what I mean by scalable is if you know the mapping, so you know the from user and who you're going to migrate the content to, just create that file in advance, right? It's pretty darn easy to do. I've done this in the real world. So for my organization, for about 2,000 users, and this entire migration of data sources and workbooks for which we're going to do here in this tutorial for 2,000 people can be done in a handful of minutes. The alternative to doing this programmatically is you could use the front end, but I would say that this is going to be a strong no for anybody that wants to save a ton of time and their sanity. If it's just 1 or 2 users, sure, do it this way. What you could do is you just go to workbooks, select all. So we filter to the workbooks owned by this user, and then just hit change owner and then choose the person you want to assign that content or migrate that content to. Works really well for a small number of users, but it's not fun at all, not fulfilling to do this type of thing for hundreds, if not thousands. All right, so how are we going to do this? What we're going to do is we're going to do this programmatically through Python using Tableau Server Clients / REST API. And to start off, we'll just run this initial configuration / setup block. This block is responsible for creating our authentication and our server objects. Through those 2 things, we're going to be able to authenticate and sign into my Tableau Cloud instance. If you're unfamiliar with lines 1 through 13, I highly recommend you check out tutorial 2 of my Automation with Tableau Server Client series. In that tutorial, I'm going to show you how to authenticate and sign into your Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance for the first time. It's super simple to do. And you're going to notice that I use that block of code throughout virtually every tutorial. So it's going to be a must for you. It's a must for me. Let's go ahead and continue. These next 4 lines of code, they're responsible for reading in that user content mapping file, right? So the one I just showed you here, that's going to basically say, hey, I want to take all of the content for each of the users in column A and migrate it to the corresponding user in column B. That's the purposes of this. And again, super scalable, do it for thousands of people in a handful of minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and close this so I don't get another permission access error whenever I try to read that in. These 2 lines here, I know that the purpose of this tutorial is not to explain like pandas or anything like that, but basically what this is going to do is it's going to take each of those columns and convert the contents of those columns to a list. Because we're going to iterate through those 2 lists using the zip function so that we basically, whenever we're in each iteration, we're working with the from user and the corresponding to user for which we're going to migrate the from user's content to, right? So let's go ahead and run this. And just to show you what that looks like, let's just say from users. Let's just say from users. So there's 1 item in that list, and there's going to be 1 item and 2 users. And basically, we're going to map that content from using that information. So how are we going to do this? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we need to sign in and authenticate and sign into our server. We're going to use the server object. We're going to say auth.signin. We're going to say Tableau authentication. This is going to allow us to authenticate and sign in, and also it's going to automatically sign us out after the execution of the nested code block. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say from user to user. in zip from users to users. And in order to assign content from one user to another, we need their locally unique identifier. So how the Tableau Server or Cloud instance uniquely identifies a particular user on your server. And to do that, what we need to do is we need to retrieve each of the user's objects maintained on your server or cloud instance using the API. So what we're going to do is we're going to say from user is equal to server.user. So we're going to use the user's endpoint. We're going to say filter name is equal to, and we're going to get this name. So this is going to be that value that's maintained in the user content mapping file. We're going to say from user and then retrieve the first item from the list returned from our server. So there should technically, the user should be unique in terms of email address or username, depends on what you're using. So if your organization uses Tableau Cloud and you use your email to authenticate, that's what your username attribute will be. But if you use let's say use a username that's specific to you at your organization that you use to sign in to your local machine, that's also a possibility. It will be that, right? The best way to know what your Tableau Cloud instance or server is using, just go to your user or your account settings and see what's here, right? And that's what we're going to be using to map the content to and from. That's what your user content mapping file should contain to make this easy, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say from user and to user. Same idea, server.users, use the user's endpoint, retrieve the specific user object associated with the to user. And again, it should only be one. So let's go ahead and run this. And then what I'll do is I'll show you what this looks like, right? So we retrieve the user objects. So from user, let's just say the dictionary representation of this object. And notice that here's our user object and here are the attributes maintained for that object. So for every user, these are the same attributes maintained. It's just obviously their values, corresponding values are going to be different, right? So for this user, the email address is this and the name attribute is this. And that's what we filtered on, right? So we use the user's endpoint and we retrieve the user object of interest by using a filter for name. And that name value happens to be in our user content mapping file, right? There's no coincidence. All right, so same thing with to user. It's basically same mapping. And the important pieces of this is not the entire object, it's just the attributes, the ID attribute here, because we're going to take each of the content owned by the from users, and we're going to update the owner ID of the workbooks and data sources maintained for that user to be the to users owner user ID attribute value. So basically this, right? So I'm going to take all of the from users content and update the owner ID attribute value to reflect the to users user ID. All right, to do that, it's pretty straightforward. What I'm about to show you here, I have mentioned quite a few times throughout my previous tutorial. So generating data sources reports, generating workbooks reports, updating data sources, deleting data sources, creating data sources, same thing for workbooks. I've showed this quite a few times, but here it is. So data sources is equal to data source or data source in tsc.pager server.data sources. And what this would allow us to do is it allow us to retrieve all the data sources maintained on my Tableau server or Tableau Cloud instance that I have access to. But I don't want everything, right? Because I'm not trying to migrate all of the content on my server to one user. I'm trying to migrate all the content maintained or owned by one user to another user. And to do that, I'm going to say if data source owner ID, because there's an owner ID attribute maintained for data sources and workbooks. I'm going to say only retrieve those data sources that are owned by the from user dot ID, right? So that's going to allow me to only get the workbooks and data sources that are owned by this person. In this case, data sources, because that's what this list of comprehension is dedicated to. Let's go ahead and do that for workbooks. So instead of the data sources endpoint, we're going to use the workbooks endpoint. And we're going to say workbook. So for each of those workbooks, validate or determine whether the owner ID attributes and value maintained for that workbook is equal to the from user's user ID value. And that's going to give me the workbooks that are owned by this person. And we're doing that because we want to migrate those from that person to the person represented by the to user value. All right, so let's just go ahead and run this and I'll show you what that looks like. So server has no data sources. Again, So I'm a 2-word. I'm on team 2-word when it comes to data source. Tableau's on team 1-word. So just make sure that you check your spelling and that you remove the space here. So let's go ahead and run that again. And let's go ahead and look at data sources. So the data sources are just going to contain a list of the data sources maintained on my server. So it's these data sources objects. But if you actually want to see the attributes maintained for each of these, you can do this. Just use the dictionary implementation of each of these. And voila, here you have it. Same thing with workbooks. You can do the same thing. That's not really the purpose of this tutorial, but just added that in there just as an FYI. All right, so what are we going to do next? Well, we have those data sources and workbooks owned by the from user. We're going to update the owner ID attributes for each of those. So in this case here, we have an owner ID attribute. The idea is to update this to reflect the to users user ID at value, which as a result is going to migrate the content from the from user to the to user. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say, and use the Pythonic way of checking to see if data sources or workbooks is empty or not. So I'm going to say if data sources. So if the user owns data sources, let's go ahead and say for data source and data sources. So iterate through those data sources. And we're going to say data source. So for each of those data source, update the owner ID attribute to be the to user ID attribute. And then we're not done there because that's just updating the object we've retrieved, right? That's not updating the object that's actually maintained on the server, right? So this data source, I could change this to whatever I want, but unless I use the update method at the data sources endpoint to, like, I guess if you will, commit this change, it doesn't do anything, right? So let's go ahead and do that now. So server.datasources.update and data source item is equal to data source. We're going to do the same exact thing for workbooks. So I'm going to say if workbooks. So this is going to check to see, did we find any workbooks owned by the from user? If we did, let's go ahead and iterate through those. Update the owner ID for each of those. And then use the workbooks endpoint to update the owner ID. All right. So as a result of executing this code, what we're going to see again is we're going to see on my Tableau Cloud instances, we're going to see these 5 workbooks and these 13 data sources migrated from this account, so this account here, to this account here, which currently has nothing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it on this page, and what we'll do is we'll execute the code block and then come back to this and refresh here. So let's go ahead and do that. With any luck, I haven't made any typos, and I see I had a typo right here actually. So I'm going to have to rerun that. So what I will do is I'll just comment this out. It really won't matter if I comment this out or not, because you're basically going to retrieve 0 workbooks. Okay, so we've successfully done it. The code block ran successfully. Let's go ahead and check back on our Tableau Cloud instance to see what has happened. All right, so again, I'm on the user that we migrated the content to. You see 0, but as soon as I refresh this, we should see 5 workbooks and 13 data sources. Wow, we have 18, and 5 plus 13 is 18. The breakout is 5 workbooks, 13 data sources. So we've successfully migrated the content associated with this user to this user using our user content mapping file, Tableau Server client / REST API, and Python. Again, I highly recommend, if you're going to do this like in a scalable way, use a user content mapping file. And one of the easiest ways to get that started, and just so you know, like so you don't go through a ton of pain trying to get that information, you can technically just come here and say users is equal to user for user and tsc.pager server.users. And you're just going to basically retrieve all the user information. So for all the users on your server or Tableau Cloud instance, you can write that to a file, and then you can begin constructing your user content mapping file by looking at that list and trying to pair up the from user and the to user, right? So users, just print that out. Let's go ahead and user for user, TC. Yeah, okay, so let's go ahead and print it out. 2 users, and again, you would write this to a user content mapping file and then begin the pairing process. There may be easy ways to identify the pairs that you can do programmatically too, as opposed to doing it manually in Excel. For example, if you're migrating from one domain to another, well, the prefix to the account or the beginning portion of the account should be the same. So you would just find the 2 accounts that have this same beginning, and then have that mapped right from the from user to the to user based on the difference in domain name. Okay. So that wraps up this video on updating content ownership programmatically through Tableau Server clients. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance through automation. If you'd like to check out this file on my GitHub, it's going to be here. So if we go to my GitHub and we go to Bridging the Gaps, and then we go to Content Ownership, you can come to the User Content Reassignment file, and it's basically going to be just sitting in here for you. You can copy and paste this and then make the necessary changes to make it work with your Tableau Clouds or Tableau Server instance. One of those quick changes is definitely going to be your token name, your token value, and the site ID, along with the way you store or retrieve your token name and token value. I use Keyring. I know a lot of people like to use an environment file. Keyring for me has worked like a charm, so I've just stuck with it. Again, small changes, but it's all here for you to just jumpstart your ability to address this type of issue programmatically. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.